So thank you, everyone. Now, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Laurie Fisher, who uses she, her pronouns, and is a Spring member based out of Scarborough. Second, we have Lubaba Gemma, who uses she, her pronouns, and is a Spring member also based out of Scarborough. And lastly, we have David Arruda, who uses he, him pronouns, and is a Spring member based out of Toronto. Before I hand it over to our speakers, I'll just explain how this meeting will work. The speakers will go for a total of 30 minutes. Then we will have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end and in their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list. I'll be using an equity speakers list, which means I may not call on you in the sequence you raised your hands, but we will try to prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions and/or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contribution to 3 minutes max. This will allow for more contributions during the discussion. And finally, we encourage you to post on social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. Please use hashtag RedOctober2025. You can tag Spring on all platforms at SpringMag.ca. Okay, and over to the speakers. Loretta, please take us away.
Thank you. And good morning, Red October. So we're going to be talking about the Combahee River Collective, which was founded in 1974, and we are going to refer to it probably a lot. So CRC, same thing. So I'm going to start by talking about why a number of Black academics at that time joined a collective of feminists to include struggles against racism. And I'm just imagining that people already know there's probably a lot of reasons why they did it. There were already feminist groups. So I'm just going to get more into a detail of what was happening at the time, because there's so many reasons, but this one reason might just make it pretty clear too. Not that Black people and Black women haven't put up a resistance before this time, but in 1927, after a Supreme Court ruling in 1927 that led to the forced sterilization of some 70,000 women, the number of states using legal provisions for the sterilization of so-called feeble-minded and criminals increased dramatically. In several states, women were institutionalized at much higher rates than men for the exact expressed purpose of being sterilized, which is a euphemism for an invasive physical operation where your ability to reproduce is removed. In the records available, women of color were forcibly sterilized at much higher rates than white women. For example, in North Carolina, African American women accounted for 64.8% of those sterilized by the Eugenics Board between 1964 and 1966, a rate more than 5 times their population representation. The issue of sterilization abuse and its disproportionate impact on women of color became a rallying point for feminists of color in the 60s and 70s. So not only had the American governments of southern states literally legislated the incapacitation of disabled women's and Black women's bodies to prevent the birth of children, they had also successfully carried it out, implementing it regularly for about 50 years by the time the Combahee River Collective was able to form and try to rise up and speak out against it. White feminists championed the issue, of course, but in 1973, the same year Roe versus Wade was decided, Ginsburg filed a federal case to challenge involuntary sterilization. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think that's her name. She sued members of the Eugenic Board of North Carolina on behalf of Niall Ruth Cox, a black mother who had been coercively sterilized under North Carolina's sterilization of persons mentally defective program, on penalty of her family losing welfare. During a 2009 interview with the New York Times, Justice Ginsburg stated, "I had thought that at the time Roe was decided, there was concern about population growth, and particularly growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of." The words came out of her mouth. Maybe that's not what she meant. Maybe she didn't believe that herself when she was talking about what all the other justices around her believed, but it came out. But this was, the time that it was, so she really didn't have to answer for it until 3 years later. The New York Times did a follow-up interview in 2012 at an appearance of Yale, where Justice Ginsburg claimed that her 2009 quote was vastly misinterpreted and clarified her stance. I don't know how she clarified her stance, it doesn't say. So it's quite likely her stance may not have been adequately clarified among those populations in question. Although Justice Ginsburg is a bona fide feminist, warrior, a leader, a white woman applauded for her highly successful achievements, to recognize the rights of women. So we're prone to give her the benefit of the doubt. But since those words hinted that she might be helping while still believing there were too many of us, then I guess it stands to reason that black women of that time would take our causes into our own hands, making our liberation our responsibility. I mention all this to help show the socio-political climate that was the reality of North America at that time in history. The need for a black feminist collective led by black women was more than a request for an inclusion in human rights. It was a stance against legislators using this easy access in real time to criminalize, institutionalize, and sterilize poor, disabled, and marginalized women. These particular women were already trapped in poverty, but government legislation put them at this greater risk. At the heart of it, the very heart of it, was the theory of eugenics. Eugenics boards were bluntly named and empowered to take these steps to purify the white race and to populate the US with a superior white race. It was a living, nightmarish reality for all mentally disabled people, as well as for any black woman in the southern states who didn't even have to be diagnosed as feeble-minded. They just had to be criminalized, institutionalized for any number of Jim Crow reasons. In the South, they'd already been successful at normalizing the lynching of black males at this time. So additionally, this was the way less visible cessation of reproductive rights of large numbers of black females. Government, health and child care agencies, and education were all complicit, not to mention white religious institutions. Southern US governments passed laws to drastically decrease the population growth of black Americans, and northern US governments were taking notes, but black female academics were also taking notes. This is where the CRC comes in. So when the Combahee River Collective made their vision known in 1977, they'd already been working hard from 1974 to bring in forced sterilization of black women to a close. The CRC that Spring members are speaking about today is the Boston-based black lesbian feminist Combahee River Collective. The group's mission statement in 1977, sorry I don't know how to use a mic. The group's mission statement noted, issues and projects that collective members have actually worked on are sterilization abuse, abortion rights, battered women, rape, and healthcare. From consistent anti-sterilization activism to their dedicated Marxist social activism to LGBTQ activism, and struggles against related oppressions, the work of the CRC has been very instructive for fighting against intersecting abuses and oppressions. It has also been extremely difficult to get the voices of Black women to be given any legitimacy in the US political climate, both then and now. But since the study of hierarchies confirms that Black women are at the very bottom of North American social structures, it's clear why CRC is dedicated to Marxist socialist theory, which is determined to lead class struggle from the bottom up. The studies also confirmed oppressions are interlocked. And my spring comrade David A. will touch on that further, plus speak on the original intention of CRC's identity politics. But I just wish to mention here that under white supremacy in North America, it was silently but tacitly decreed that Black people should never get as much reward or remuneration due to unwritten laws of disenfranchisement, but should get the full extent of state punishment for perceived infractions. This war is one-sided against their own citizens and is like a sudden storm hitting us when we dare to speak of the roadblocks placed to prevent our advancement and our children's dreams for the future. Just speaking up for ourselves can cause a tremendous backlash. Case in point, the highest government agencies in Canada today refuse to acknowledge well-documented racialized abuse in government with regard to how to deal with this colonial, racist, patriarchal backlash. We can learn a lot from CRC strategies fighting class war, racism, sexism, and capitalism simultaneously. Let's research the strategies of CRC members, the many subsequent trailblazing followers to which this course is dedicated: Audre Lorde, Barbara and Beverly Smith, Demita Fraser, Angela Davis, and Afeni Shakur, to name a few. Plus other great feminist leaders of color, such as Lee Maracle and Bell Hooks. And all I can end with is, please get your reading list lined up, including Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, and the book that we call How We Get Free. And this one, anyway, I had another book, but it's too late. By the way, my last point is that slavery is not our history. Rather, African history was interrupted and erased through being enslaved by North American colonialists. Both African and indigenous cultures were destroyed, limited in different but similarly devastating ways. We are therefore forever united in solidarity and resistance in our anti-imperial struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. And as Loretta said, How We Get Free is at the spring book table, so take a look after. So at this moment, I'm just going to touch on the feminist component of the CRC. As Loretta just so wonderfully spoke to, all the things that these women were dealing with at the time that they were creating the CRC, but also organizing, they note that there's just a huge psychological toll that Black women face every day in facing matters as large as the ones that Loretta mentioned, but also even things that we take for granted today. Like Barbara Smith talks about how when she was trying to get going in writing, she couldn't buy an electronic typewriter because credit was attached to a husband. So as a single woman, she couldn't actually get credit, and she couldn't afford it. Thankfully, she was able to get it through an aunt, but a barrier or a hurdle that no one should ever have to face, right? And I'll turn to Barbara again, because we see all these challenges reproduced in the family as well. And she notes that during family gatherings, the women, after dinner was had, the women had to continue working, and the men would go off into their separate room and talk politics and talk work, all these other factors. So even within the household, we're seeing separation on the top, on important matters, right? And these are kind of the barriers that they were dealing with in their everyday life. But looking at the challenges and even trying to organize in, say, particularly like male-dominated spaces, both within the left and, like, say, Black liberation movements, right? They were dealing with, I'll look at it from, let's say, white male-dominated areas, right? They were dealing with a lot of sectarian thought, right, and also a lot of misogyny, and they would also face a lot of homophobia as well, right? But Barbara Smith kind of points to it beautifully, where she says, the value system of those men was different than the ones of the CRC, because the CRC's value system was not shaped by the airless ideological sectarianism of the white European left, right? But also, while tackling that, they're tackling, again, a black liberation space where the presumption was male dominance, right? They quote, a quote from Kwame Ture, who on most things is rather good, but he says that the position of black women in the movement is to be prone or supine, right? So they're dealing with that, and they're trying to deal with, as again Loretta spoke to, an issue of forced sterilization, but while also trying to enhance reproductive rights for women, right? And for many in that space, for obvious reasons, forced, abortion, reproductive rights, and birth control was tied to forced sterilization and genocide, essentially. So it was hard to bridge those gaps, and because of the misogyny they were facing, many of the men did not want to address this, and they also felt that by focusing on that issue, they would lose support, because they would, it would be turning away from what they thought was important, but not to what these women thought was important. And this is why when the CRC was doing all their wonderful work, they were able to get such a groundswell, because they were both able to deal and act, work against forced sterilization, but work towards reproductive rights, so that, as Demita Fraser spoke, we don't have people dying in back alleys just trying to get health care, right? But they also dealt with this in white feminist spaces as well. Although there were wonderful organizations, a lot of socialist feminist organizations, they were dealing with the mainstream feminist organizations that were mostly bourgeoisie or middle class, and they often worked against the needs of these women, and they didn't recognize the way in which they were also oppressing other working class people, right? Up until about 1960, when we look at Angela Davis's Women, Class, and Race, she said that about 1/3 of black women were working in household labor, which typically they were then answering or speaking to white women who were, essentially exploiting and oppressing these women. And the women within the white feminist organizations weren't able to, or at least weren't willing to, address this contradiction within a white settler colonial society. So these were some of the other things that they were dealing with and organizing around. So I'm just going to pass it on to Lubaba to speak to the next point.
Thanks, David. As the talk suggests, the next point that we'll be discussing is the aspect of queer liberation and organizing for lesbians within the Combahee River Collective. And like my fellow speakers mentioned, we will be referring to the Combahee River Collective as the CRC or the collective throughout most of this talk. But what was really significant about the CRC is that they positioned their fight in the broader anti-capitalist fight, right? Under the sentiment that none of us are free until all of us are free, until those that are at the bottom of our power structures are free. So in the same way that black women have specific equity issues, they are fighting against that black men do not face in the same way. Black queer women face oppressions that do not apply to black heteronormative women that in the same way. Yet our fight must be taken on by all of us, right? We must fight together to ensure our liberation is integral, that we build our power, and that we must ensure that that we share the burden so that we don't lose our people. We don't lose our people power either to burnout or to sickness. And so we can actually replicate these sentiments of community care in an integral way. And Barbara Smith also described the early activities of the collective as simple things like that we discussed last night at the opening rally, as well as these simple revolutionary acts. She talks about consciousness raising and political work on a multitude of issues, along with the building of friendship networks, community, and a rich black women's culture where none had existed before, with a particular focus on bringing in more black lesbians. Now, their inclusion of this identity was incredibly far-sighted given the time that they were writing. So at a time where even a racial justice was widely contested, it was unexpected that socialists would be fighting for gender equity and sexual or reproductive justice. Like, wouldn't this just be a losing battle if we're diverting our resources, right? Many, particularly white Marxists, would argue that we are asking for too much. But the reality is that our fight can only be effective if we look at an issue from a holistic perspective. If we prioritize exclusionary organizing from the beginning, this will only result in exclusionary organizing throughout. This is precedent setting, right? If we start off with exclusionary politics, we are that much more at risk of maintaining those. To have truly effective organizing, we need to organize with integrity and inclusivity. And instead, the CRC underscored that we cannot fight these battles exclusively. Rather, our socialist and anti-capitalist organizing would have to be informed by intersecting oppressions if we are to achieve true and just liberation. These are truly where the roots of intersectionality of identity politics come from, because this is the point of identity politics. It is to ensure that we recognize all of the oppressions that are acting together, rather than, having a girl boss or a CEO like in the presidency, So in understanding that racial justice must be essential to working class liberation, we have to understand that further exclusions, such as queer people, disabled people, and our broader collective, excluding groups will only hinder our movement. And so in order to inform strong grassroots community-led movements, we have to create spaces that include all members and allies into our collective fight. And so the point to really drive home here is that the CRC paved the way for broader queer liberation, arguably ahead of the civil rights movement and even ahead of mass white queer liberation movements. We're referring to the CRC a lot based on when they were, formally introduced, such in 1974 to 77. But mind you, these women were doing this work well before that, right? And so that's why I say ahead of the civil rights movement as well. And again, ahead of mass white queer liberation movements. Black women were not waiting for white women to give them permission to be more inclusive. And these experiences, whether white women could be resentful for such, they paved the way for deeper feminist and queer organizing. And Black women continue to lead the way to our collective liberation. But we cannot expect them to solve the depths of racial inequality alone. If we don't each step up and share the burden of this fight, we, as my Gen Z peers like to say, are cooked.
Thanks, Lubaba. I almost wanted to say Slay Queen, but I didn't think it was appropriate. Considering that they mentioned that in the book is a huge thing that they hate. But what I want to, again, we're speaking to multiple things, but I want to focus on the Marxist component right now, and I'm gonna center this around identity politics, of course. One as not only as obviously a philosophy, right? Like we see the quote here, but also as an organizing strategy, right? We heard yesterday about how to what are the strategic components that we had to look at, and how do we deal with limited resources, right? And what the CRC was looking at was, okay, we have these groups that are facing multiple layers of interlocking oppressions, and because of the ills of capitalism and the fact that they're facing those ills each and every day more and more than, say, other people are, they will be more willing or they would likely see the value in radical politics, right? In activism, right? They were very much focused, as one of the panelists spoke yesterday, organizing not to hoard power, but to share it, right? To make sure that everyone was feeling empowered. And, it was very inclusive, again, not, as I mentioned about the gaps and the failures of other organizations, not sectarian, right? Barbara Smith and others mentioned, if we did not speak to many other people who were maybe not active in the same spaces, we would have lost out on knowledge, right? And that in of itself is is a very Marxist idea. It's very dialectical, right? We only in ourselves can contain so much knowledge, but as we speak to different people, that knowledge grows, right? And it just continues, and it becomes a more infinite source of knowledge for everybody, right? And again, we look at, if we're going to look in the Marxist tradition, our social conditions are what create our consciousness, not the other way around, right? So obviously the consciousness that is being developed amongst these incredible activists and the people who are organizing with the CRC are building and growing upon that history, right? And again, the reason I bring this up is because we're going to talk about how obviously identity politics is, I'm not going to say distorted, because I think it's what we see today is actually a completely different version of what the CRC was speaking to, right? But how even we see on the left, people, I don't want to say in bad faith, but maybe they're just not, maybe an ahistorical analysis, just don't recognize the value of identity politics, right? This idea is, again, just an extension, and a very powerful and important extension of Marxist thought, right? It's international, right? Because it doesn't only speak to the American or the North American context, but it speaks, they were also very active in the Vietnam movement prior to the CRC being formulated, right? But also it's liberatory, right? And again, within that same thought, Marx in Capital speaks to, labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself. We're branded in the black skin, right? They even specifically reference in How We Get Free. Again, look it up at the book table. Lenin references special oppression, right, and speaks specifically to the oppression that was faced by BIPOC individuals in the United States, right? And then even if we look to movements after the CRC's formulation, right, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso speaks to the importance of including women in the movement, right? I think he mentions, without women's participation in our social struggle, it's like using 4 fingers instead of 10, right? We're inviting failure, right? So I'll just take this last moment to speak to the issues we're seeing with identity politics today. The CRC mentions the focus on archetypes, right? They specifically note Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey. And, I think Michelle Obama mentioned, this is the greatest country in the world because someone like me can get into the White House, right? Which, I think everyone in this room would see the failure in that analysis. It's great that, sure, 1 or 2 people, I am all for, the capitalist class being more representative, right? However, okay, so that's like, what, 3, 4 people in a room, right? On the backs of everybody else. That's what we need to focus on, right? Everyone needs to get there together, and that's what the CRC was looking to do.
Thank you so much, David. I'm just going to wrap us up with some notes on the legacy of the CRC. Slide. Amazing. So capitalism requires, it necessitates fascist principles like racism, like xenophobia, like misogyny, et cetera, in order to operate effectively, right? Without these cultural issues, a slide, that divide the working class, capitalism would not be as strong as it is today. To fully create an anti-capitalist world, we have to take a multi-pronged approach to dismantling capitalism. We have to divide and conquer. And by that I mean that we must weaken the beams of hatred and fear that give structure to our capitalist systems. We must each break down the pillars we individually fuel while we strengthen our collective power. And when these big ideas become overwhelming, I like to come back to this question. Who are you accountable to? And I see Comrade Adam in the room. This is very much their quote. I am quoting them. They said this to me 1.5 years ago, and it blew my mind. I was like, that is the North Star. Who am I? Who are you? Who are each of us accountable to? Most would say their community, right? So who is your community? Who do you have the privilege of having access to? How are you being accountable to them and their experience of oppression? That's your North Star. So upholding integrity of identity politics, let's come back to the true meaning of these roots. Again, it's not the girl boss, it's not the CEO, it's not Michelle Obama saying, look, I get to live in this house that was built by slaves. My girl. That's not the point. That's not the progress you think it is. And to bring it back to the let's be real about the experiences of structural and systemic racism. Let's bring it back to the anti-Blackness, but to the disparities that Black women and especially queer Black women face. to the social services under attack that disproportionately impact Black women, and to non-Black people that decenter Black women in the fight for transformative racial justice, we need to, again, ground ourselves and ask ourselves, who are we accountable to? How am I being accountable to them? And so some key lessons that we really want to center in our theory and practice is that we must find ways to integrate our organizing from a holistic perspective. Could you go back one slide? Amazing. Sorry, I put these in the wrong order. We can't be exclusionary, like I mentioned, or else this will result in our detriment. We have to act in our communities each and every day in our own roles. We challenge anti-Black narratives and shift our collective understanding of oppression. And as such, we have to find ways to make organizing easy, accessible, and everywhere. One example of that is that, and my personal example of that is that other POCs really need to establish solidarity across racial divides and fighting anti-Blackness in our communities. As an anecdote, as a brown woman, I was raised on the basis that my beauty was my main indicator of value, and that the lighter my skin, the more beautiful I'd be. Well, I don't see that in myself today, or in my broader South Asian community, or the broader people that I surround myself with, this rhetoric is still upheld in the broader South Asian community and amongst other brown people. My work here looks like challenging these ideas, this rhetoric, and the internalized white supremacy that these ideas reinforce. And so to recap, the feminism of the CRC brought the perspective that was eloquently stated by Alicia Garza, based on their own experience having to navigate a world that didn't want them. They found ways to bridge historical gaps and expand our understanding of contradictions that can arise when equity is not centered in our movements. And that's one of our main principles that we speak to here at Spring, centering equity, because equity is an expression of class. It is not something that stands beside class or separate from so. The CRC is explicitly anti-capitalist in their analysis of liberation, identity politics, and its focus on ensuring that we all work toward a better society together, and they provide a framework for building a stronger socialist or leftist movement. So sorry, I mixed up my notes. But all this to say is that all of us need to step up to take on this burden. We can't, be overpowering and decentralizing the fight, but rather relieving Black women of the current burden that exists on their shoulders. Sorry, my notes are all over the place. All this to say, I have shared some of my anecdotes on what this looks like in my life. I encourage you to do the same. And also, I encourage you to read How We Get Free by Keeanga-Yamada Taylor, that the three of us read in preparation for this talk. She's a fantastic author, and she's an incredible writer. And I highly recommend that you check out the Spring book table and take a look at this book, as well as some of the other materials that we have to share. Slide. And that's it from us.